Okay. All right. So again, we are in the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm just going to kind of we had last week off, but let me just kind of remind you of what we've done. Jesus is up on a mountain. He's just called all of his 12 apostles, right? So now he's got a new group, and he's going to teach them specifically, even though there are large crowds that are around, but he's really teaching them. How are they, as his disciples and apostles, supposed to act, and what does righteousness look like that he offers in contradistinction to that of the Pharisees? And last time that we met, we covered the Beatitudes, and we talked about how that was really a logical flow of first right orientation between you and God, right? The first set, and then the second set is right orientation between you and your fellow man, right? And that then would be the basis of the true righteousness that Christ offers, as opposed to the oral laws and regulations that the Pharisees required for righteousness. The other thing to remember is that the Sermon on the Mount is not, as a unit, the rule of life for the church, nor was it the rule of life for the Messianic kingdom, but it was, the Sermon on the Mount was, what is the true righteousness of the Mosaic law? Because at this point, remember, the Mosaic law is still in effect. And so Christ is telling them, what is true righteousness in regards to the Mosaic law, right? Is it what the Pharisees say, which it's not, or is it what Jesus says, right? Now, just because the Sermon on the Mount is really about the true righteousness of the Mosaic law, that doesn't mean that as believers, even though the law now is no longer, it's been rendered inoperative, it's no longer in existence, doesn't mean that we can't pull certain things out of it. So we're going to be pulling those application elements like we did with the Beatitudes out of that. The other thing is that we ended with him giving sort of the positives of this is what it looks like when you are righteous in comparison to in consideration of the Mosaic law. Now what we're going to cover this week is we're going to cover this idea here of what happens when you fail to attain, right? So the interesting part about this is that this part isn't found in the Gospel of Matthew. Right, Matthew is 3 chapters long, but for some reason, Matthew doesn't record the converse of those positive Beatitudes. So we get that from Luke. So Luke actually records the opposite of that. What does it look like, or what is the result of those who fail to attain the righteousness? And that's the first part that we are going to look at tonight. So if we look at Luke chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. Again, this is immediately after the Beatitudes have been given. Jesus says this, "But woe to you who are rich, for you have received consolation." Okay? "Woe to you who are full now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all people speak well of you, for so their fathers did the false prophets." Now, one other thing that I just want to make sure that we are clear is that the main idea behind the Sermon on the Mount is what righteousness is required to enter the kingdom, right? That's the question that comes up. In fact, in chapter 5 of Matthew, verse 20, he's going to say, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. So the sermon is really what type of righteousness is required to enter the kingdom. Now, I just want to stop here for a second. When Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, or Matthew says kingdom of heaven, because the Jews would not pronounce the name of God, so he puts in heaven as a euphemism for the actual word there that would be God. What kingdom is he talking about? When he says you will not enter the kingdom, what kingdom is he talking about? Not the eternal kingdom. That happens after the Messianic kingdom, and that is the eternal order, or the eternal order. But you're close. It's the one before. What is it, Rich?
Be the millennial kingdom?
The millennial kingdom or the messianic kingdom? He is the Messiah. He's offered himself as the Messiah. And it is the messianic kingdom that is what is foretold in the Old Testament that he's offering. So in order for you to get into the messianic kingdom, you have to have this type of righteousness, right? So the reason why I want to point that out is this, is when we read the Beatitudes, it can be a little confusing because he says things like, blessed are the merciful, for they will receive what? Mercy. Does that happen all the time?
No.
No. In fact, sometimes if you're the merciful one,
Yeah.
you're the chump. You can be the chump. You get taken advantage of, right? Blessed are the meek, for they will what? Inherit the earth. Do the meek inherit the earth? Usually, typically. Now, no, it's the people that are not meek. It's the people that are out there like, it's all about me and I'm all the gusto and forget about you. And they just want to walk all over people. They get their way, right? We see it all around us. So keep in mind here that Jesus is talking about, blessed are those who, in this case, are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. But that doesn't necessarily mean they'll be shown mercy in this life, because this is all about the rewards and entrance in the kingdom. So whereas those Beatitudes can look like an absolute, hey, Jesus promised if I'm merciful, everyone will show me mercy, but that doesn't seem to be happening. So something's wrong here. Well, nothing's wrong. It's just that may not happen in this life. Jesus promises if you're merciful in this life, you'll get entry into the kingdom. And when you're in the kingdom, guess what will be shown to you? Mercy, right? Okay, so I want you to keep in mind here that the Beatitudes, some of them will actually happen in this life. Sometimes when you are merciful, you get mercy extended to you, right? That does happen sometimes. Certainly when we grieve over our sin, God forgives us, right? That happens. So some of them are sort of a mixed bag of happening now, but all of them are guaranteed to happen in the kingdom, okay? Now, the reason why I mention that is because I don't want you to get disillusioned with the Beatitudes of saying, well, I was merciful and on my, no one shows me mercy. Jesus must be wrong. Well, he's talking about the benefits you get when you enter the kingdom. That's what this is all about. Does that all make sense? Clear? All right. Second reason why I want to point that out is because of these woe statements here, okay? Because he says, woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Well, if he's just talking about in this life, then of course, the people that are rich in this life, guess what? They enjoy. But what he's saying here is this. He's saying, hey, look, if you're one of those people and it's all about wealth and materialism and running all over people, good, guess what? Enjoy your 80 or 90 years of wealth. Get your big old super yacht, have your food, whatever else, enjoy everything, because this is your consolation. Like, you're going to miss out because you're not going to enter the kingdom. And in the kingdom, those who are the righteous in the kingdom, in that 1,000-year reign of Christ, they will now become those who are rich. Because they, guess what? They inherit what? The earth. The earth becomes the inheritance of the righteous. So live it up, Bill Gates or whoever it is, or Jeff Bezos or whatever the case may be. This is your consolation, right? So we want to keep both the Beatitudes, understanding that the full fulfillment of that's going to happen in the kingdom. You may experience some of those now, just like right here, for these individuals who are unrighteous, now is all you get, right? So we continue to go on. And I've got some more detail here, but I just want to walk us through this as a high level concept. Woe to you who are full now, for you shall be hungry. Great, you got a full belly. You've got fullness. You've got everything that you wanted, but you're going to be hungry. Now, remember what Jesus says to those who are unrighteous, but think they're going to be in the kingdom and sit down at Abraham's table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and feast. And what does he say? I have no idea what just happened there. Apologize. Let me see if we are still even on Zoom here. I think Zoom on you. Oh, we're still good. All right.
Would you say that they're gonna sit and feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? What does it say? They're gonna be hungry.
They're gonna be hungry. So think about this here. Hey, look, you went out, you've got all your materialism, you're all good, you're fat and happy, and you think in the kingdom, you're going to be sitting down next to Abraham and hobnobbing with him. And Jesus says, you're excluded from the kingdom, right? This is your now, this is your 80 years. Enjoy it as much as you can, because that's that's going to end. Woe to you who laugh now, those who have mirth, because guess what? You're going to mourn and weep. Why will they mourn and weep? They didn't make it. They've been excluded from the party.
I know what.
The word there is laughter. It's kind of this idea of joyful party. It's that whole concept there. Those who are laughing versus those right now who don't really have much in this life to laugh about. And he's like, yuck it up, because guess what? That's all you got, right? They are going to be mourning because they're not going to get into the kingdom, right? So I just want you to have that, both the Beatitudes and the woe statements taken in the context of, yes, there may be some in time fulfillment of both of those things, right? But the fullness of that is going to be the kingdom. Those who are not righteous, who seem to have it all now, are going to find themselves without. Those who are without now are going to find themselves with. Right? That's that contrast. All right. So we're all good, just kind of high level. All right. So we've got these four woes that Jesus pronounces, and essentially the four woes, even though there's more beatitudes, they're really in distinction to many of the beatitudes that he mentions before. So here's what it looks like if you attain righteousness, and then here's what it looks like if you do not. So if you look at the four woes, you can break them down into these different categories here. Basically, you've got wealth, right, or materialism here, but woe to you who are rich, where you received your consolation, right? The fulfillment of earthly desires, right, where he says, woe to you are full now, for you shall be hungry, like the feeling of whatever your needs are and desires are, that you have fulfilled that. Good times, fun, laughter, the whole party scene type of thing. Woe to you that laugh now, for you mourn and weep. And then reputation and fame. So woe to you when all people speak well of you, for so their fathers did to the false prophets. Okay. And all you have to do is go back and look at the prophet Jeremiah. All right. The prophet Jeremiah was not treated well at all. The false prophets, everyone said, oh yeah, they're right. Jeremiah is telling us that, the Babylonians are going to come and destroy us. The false prophets tell us something different. We like them. They had all the fame, they had all the glory, and Jeremiah is the one who gets thrown into a pit, right? So Jesus says, hey, look, be careful, because if all you're out there to do is your own glorification, your own reputation, your own fame, guess what? You got it. You might have the 80 years of the fame and fortune, but in the kingdom, you're not going to be known, right? Okay. So this is what Holcroft says in his book, The Four Gospels. He says, Jews would have known that woes or cursings were the obverse side of blessings. This is why I mentioned this earlier, is that Jesus gives the blessings and then he gives these woes as sort of the counter to that. Since Luke wrote for Gentiles, he needed to tell of this relationship. So Luke is kind of spelling out, which is probably why Matthew didn't include it. Like Matthew's readers would have known that the opposite of being in the kingdom is being excluded, which would not have been good. Luke needs to spell that out more. Okay. This is some examples here, both from John Martin and from Arnold Fruchtenbaum, of this sort of summarization then of this Beatitudes and Woes section. Fruchtenbaum says this, he said, the Pharisees did not recognize their spiritual depravity, right? They thought everything was great. We're rich, we're famous, we are, everyone loves us, we're in control and in power. They saw no need for righteousness, right? Beyond their own, and no need for repentance. And you see that throughout the Gospels, just their arrogance, their self-righteousness, right? They're looking down on those who they think are less than them, those who are the sinners. They demanded submission to their authority and withheld mercy from those who needed it. such as the publicans. Furthermore, they were concerned only with the external demands of the law, and they caused discord among the Jews. Having a position of authority, they were guilty of persecuting others, particularly those who chose to believe in Yeshua or Jesus. And Martin sums it up this way. He says, in contrast with the disciples who had given up everything to follow Jesus, were the people who refused to give up anything to follow him, right? And we have some of those stories, like the rich young ruler, right? He's told to like sell all his possessions and follow Jesus, and what does he do? Went away. Didn't want to do it, right? So they're in contrast to those who refused to give up anything to follow him. These were the rich, the well-fed, the ones who laugh, who were popular. They did not understand the gravity of the situation which confronted them. They refused to follow the one who could bring them into the kingdom, and therefore Jesus pronounced woes on them. These woes were the exact reversal of their temporal benefits. That's the reason why I said, yeah, they might get temporal benefits now in this life, but they're going to lose it in the next one. And they're the exact opposites of the blessings and rewards of Jesus's followers. So that's kind of, again, that summary of that particular section. So before we go on, any questions about that? We've had the Beatitudes, the positive side of those who attain. We've got the woes, which is the negative side of those who fail to attain. They're going to be excluded from the kingdom. Right? Any questions or comments on that before we go to the next section?
When I think woes here, like particularly the crowds,
Mhm.
I think of, like rock concerts right now,
Yeah.
not now, but, since they started. I saw this picture of the Rolling Stones in 1978 at RFK Stadium in Washington DC. And it looked like there was about 100,000 people there.
Yeah.
They didn't have those kind of crowds back then, did they? I'm thinking of
I
what a
don't-
crowd looked like today, and how, because I don't know. I mean, it's really interesting how, we, in the culture idolize, certain people for the talents that they have.
Sure, Super Bowl's coming up on Sunday.
Exactly.
Prime example.
I mean, and when the Lions were playing the 49ers at whatever stadium that is in Detroit, the place was packed. There's streams coming down from the thing and TVs, people yelling and screaming.
And then the
And I
camera
bet there
panned to Taylor Swift, and then of course, another
I bet
3
there
million
were
people.
empty churches all over.
I'm sure there were. What was your point? Yeah.
What's my point?
He wants to.
Well,
Jeff,
I
what's your
just-
point?
I mean, what would have been a crowd back in the day? Where did?
It wouldn't have been like 100,000, but certainly, we've got the feeding of the 5,000, which only includes the men. So you got women and children, so you've got probably it's probably like 20, maybe 25, who knows, 1,000 people that are there. Not really 100,000, but at least I don't think. Yeah. And without voice amplification, there's only a certain amount you can.
How this applies to today, with all the examples. It's
Yeah.
almost like this was written for now.
Yeah, I mean,
And it was-
look, you don't have to look far
No.
in whether it's politics, whether it's business, whether it's in entertainment. This is the pursuit of life
Yeah.
in this life. And sometimes we can get really, sometimes you can get a little jealous of that. Like I would not mind riding around on Jeff Bezos' like super duper yacht. I mean,
Have you seen that
thing's bigger than my whole,
thing?
housing complex, right?
Running
Yeah.
out on the lakes.
What
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, what comes to mind as a part of this is, these, organizations that profess the, what is the term they use?
Prosperity.
Prosperity
Yeah, yeah.
gospel.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's
Totally.
all, that came
Yeah.
to mind.
Yeah, and of course, what we learn about in the Beatitudes is Jesus says, yeah, actually, the opposite is going to happen. In fact, he said, look, if they've persecuted me, they're going to do what? Persecute you. And we just even had there in the woes, like, look, woe to them who speak well of you, for so they did their false prophets, which means if you're a true prophet, guess what? You're not going to get spoken well of. you're gonna be the one that and everyone looks and goes, you're just you're an idiot. You're one of those types of people. So that whole idea is just, it's super foreign to the whole New Testament and the early church experience, right? And you can say a lot about that one. Okay, so he's now given that. Here's what it looks like for those who attain. Here's what it looks like for those who don't attain. Now what he's going to do is he's going to, in Matthew, come back and say, all right, for those of you who are my disciples, my followers, we've already kind of discussed what your life should look like, but what's the practical then outworking of that in the world? There should be an impact to the world if you are truly a follower of Christ. That's the whole point. If you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you should have an impact on the world. And if you don't, you might want to rethink whether or not you have a relationship with Christ. I mean, look, I don't judge anybody in, well, very few people. Some people I think are probably clearly not Christians, but there are some that claim to be Christians where I look at it and go, I don't know, man, there is zero fruit on that tree. God is, I let him judge that. But the principle here and other parts of scriptures is, if you are a believer, you will have fruit. It might be scrawny, it might be shriveled up. Like, hey, look, you might have like a,
Brown spots on?
yeah, you might have almost no leaves and just like a little, like, you will have some fruit. Does that make sense? You cannot be a believer without some impact and some fruit in your life.
What's in it, so we don't always know the and the fruit that's being bare. We may not
Totally.
see the fruit, but it's there.
I had someone come into my office today. There's an individual that retired about, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years ago from where I work at, and the big end. And he's super liberal, really nice guy though. And look, I love the guy dearly, very liberal. But we'd have lots of conversations, and have conversations about God and about, politics. I mean, just everything. And someone came into my office today and said, hey, look, I just ran into so-and-so. And he just he asked, hey, how's Randall? How's he doing? He goes, you know what? He was one of the only conservatives that I knew that I actually liked and respected. And I didn't know I had that kind of an impact on him. He never said that to me, but thinking like, gosh, who knows? I mean, to your point, we had lots of discussions about God, and he never agreed with me on that. But to know that, hey, at least he looked at it and said, you know what? I respect that. I see the fruit, even if I don't necessarily want the fruit. I respect the fruit. So that's a great point. Okay, great. So that's what this next section then is great. If you are one who is attaining because you're having that righteousness, what should your life then look like? What impact, right? So he gives 2 examples here. He says this: you are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. All right? That's what he's saying. This is what we should look like. So, 2 metaphors: salt and light. This is what he's going to use here. Now, salt, right? In the ancient world in particular, like, we just use it pretty much. I mean, we do use it to preserve, but not for the most part. I mean, manufacturers of our food use it to preserve, but typically at home, we're not salting our meat and then trying to keep it from rotting. But we do use it for taste. Back in the ancient world, though, you didn't have refrigerators or ice boxes. So it was used for flavor. It was used for preserving, right? But also salt makes people thirsty, right? So we've got these 3 attributes of salt, right? If you are salt, what does salt do, right? And so the first one there is it improves flavor of taste of the food. So we should, through our good works, be providing flavor to life. Does that make sense? Like we should make life worth living, not only for ourselves, but for those we interact with. Like we should be providing good, beneficial flavor to the world, right? That's what should happen. And in fact, you know, if you do a study of the charitable, hospitals, orphanages, charitable organizations, they were started by Christians. In fact, in most people, yeah, most of them are by Christians, yeah. A lot of the countries that these were started in, their religious perspective said, for instance, if it's Hinduism, right? Buddhism. If you are lame and sick and ill, guess what? What's that? Because you deserved it. And guess what? If you're reincarnated, you might be reincarnated as a slug next time because of what you've done in this life. Like, in other words, your situation here is deserved. So why should I help you? Right? But Christians came in and said, no. Humans are created in the image of God. We are to care for people, we're to show mercy. And so that demonstration of care for mankind is what started hospitals and orphanages and things all around the world, and particularly in areas that their own religious or ideological systems would have actually been contrary to that. That's just an example of how, as believers, we add that flavor to the world. The world is going down the hill fast, and it ends up. I mean, sin leads to what? Death, judgment. It leads to remorse. It'll catch you up to you, even just from a purely non-spiritual perspective. Sin will destroy you. You see it in people all the time. We have the message, we have the light, in this case, the salt, that can help people to actually experience life in the way that God wants them to experience it. All right, that's what we can bring. But we also, salt serves as a preservative. So we're salt in the world, we are acting as a preservative. We're preserving the world, and without the salt, guess what happens? You leave a piece of meat out without salt, what? Rotten, destruction, right? Without believers in the world representing, demonstrating, being the image of Christ to the world, this world is nothing but evil. It's the reason why no human system, humanity system, or a system based on human good, without God ever succeeds. All right? You remove the believer from the world, and the world is, in fact, this will actually happen. Well, at least from my perspective, it will. Let me just say that from my perspective. And then you'll see what happens to the world when believers are gone. There is Paul talks about this restraining force. Now, again, theologians disagree on what that is, whether it's the Holy Spirit, whether it's believers. But whether it's one or the other, when that is removed from the world, that restraining force, evil abounds. We are the primary reason why this world still is spinning. Do you know what I'm saying? Still isn't falling off its hinge, off the ledge, right? So you're there to stand up for that, and we have that type of godly influence on the world. Even though sometimes it feels like we're a minority, we're really not. I mean, we are a minority, but we're not as much a minority as what we might think, right? The last thing is salt makes people thirsty. And I like what Louis Barbieri says this. He says, Jesus's followers would be like salt in that they would create a thirst for greater information. When one sees a unique person who possesses superior qualities in specific areas, he desires to discover why that person is different. Now, here's the one thing I'm going to say about this. Many times as believers, we're like, oh, yeah, I need to be different from the world. The world needs to see I'm different. But most of the time, that comes in the form of what? How do we usually distinguish ourselves from the world? By all the things we don't do. Oh, no, we don't do that. we don't drink and we don't smoke and we don't chew and we don't have sex outside of marriage. And I mean, it's this long list of don'ts. Does that all make sense what I'm saying here? And we basically put Christianity up as a list of things that we don't do. And if you don't do that, that's the same thing as being a Christian. But that's not, if you go back to the Beatitudes, Jesus didn't mention any of that stuff. What does he talk about? Mercy. He talks about mourning for your sin, right? Talks about hunger and thirst for righteousness, right? In other words, what should separate us isn't so much what we don't do. Of course, there are things that we shouldn't do. I'm not saying that. But what should separate us to the world isn't so much of this type of stuff of not doing it, but they should see all the things in the Beatitudes that Christ said will follow a person who attains to righteousness. That's how you do that. You extend mercy to the person who's just been unmerciful to you. Because the world doesn't do that. The world says if someone's been mean to you, guess what? Kick them back. And you have the right to do that, right? I mean, that's the world's view. So our distinguishing quality should be based off of what Christ said it was, at least primarily. That doesn't mean we don't stand up for things that are wrong, that are going on in the world. I'm not saying that we don't stand up and say, this is not okay, we shouldn't do that. That's not my point. But my point is, our primary way of making people thirsty and standing out from the world is by being the type of people Jesus asked us to be in the Beatitudes. And when we do that, you'll look weird. You'll look different. You might look a little salty to people in a good way. Does that all make sense? All right. Jesus basically says here, look, he says, he's going to talk about this in a light from a different perspective, but look, if salt is actually, the ability for salt to lose its flavor is actually, it's kind of like an oxymoron. That's the nature of salt. Salt is salty. It's not salty plus something. I mean, that's the nature of salt. It can, in some cases, if it's not refined, it can go bad. But basically what he's saying here is he's making a statement that basically says, look, you are salt. And if you're not salty, guess what you're not? You're not salt. You're worthless. Salt should be salty. That's the nature of what it does. It's its purpose. That's what it's designed and created to do, is to be salty, right? You and I are created to be salt. And if you're not salty, then you're not salt. You put it the right way. You're not salt. All right. This is what Holcroft says. He says, just as salt resists decay and spoilage, so the believer is to extend his influence on earth. The salt that is used to preserve is, however, ordinarily sacrificed in the process. The idea of unsalty salt is seen as a deliberate paradox, though impurities in unrefined salt may sometimes cause it to become insipid and useless. In the spiritual realm, Christians who so adapt to the world that no difference can be seen become unsalty salt. That's unsalty salt is a paradox. Unsalty salt, wet, dry, right? It's what he's saying, right? That's what Christ is saying. All right. The second analogy that he uses, or metaphor that he uses here, is the idea of light, right? And he starts off by describing it as a city on a hill. Now, we don't really think too much about that, but back in the ancient times, when it was night, you only had two sources of light: the moon and the stars, and whatever came from any buildings. And guess what? Those buildings didn't have electricity. All right, so if you were a city, any of you ever go out in the wilderness or the forest away from the city here, and you just all of a sudden, I mean, it's just amazing what a little bit of light out in that type of environment does compared to, just being in town. So we have to put ourselves back there, and that's what Christ says. He says, look, you're supposed to be light like a city on a hill. You should be seen. Like, it should be visible. It shouldn't be hard to recognize where the city is, right? Those days, you could go for miles and still see a city way up there because of the light that shines, and which would direct you to where that's at, right? So he uses that idea of the city on a hill, but then he also gives the idea of in the house, electricity. So what do? Got a lampstand that has a candle with a wick, or an oil lamp, depending, maybe an oil lamp. Probably more likely an oil lamp. And that gives light to the entire room. I mean, like this right here, what we're sitting in right now, this is this is unheard of back then. But in a dark house, when when the power goes out, I'm telling you, it's pitch black, and you get that one little lantern that you have out there, or you get some candles and you light it. Now again, it's not going to light up, there you go, flashlight. It's not going to light up the whole thing like these lights here do, but it's visible. Like everyone huddles around the light and no one goes to the room where where it's dark. They're drawn to the light because in darkness, that's where you want to be, right? So we are people that draw people to the light. And guess what? The world is described as being in darkness. That's why Christ describes it this way. You are the light, and people want light when they're in dark. So we need to be those type of people that people want to be around. They want to know. And sometimes, like I've mentioned several times, as Christians, it's just like we've sucked on lemons, and we're nothing but sour, caustic, just like we don't even want to be around each other, much less the world. Like if you're not a believer, man, I go out and party with my friends. They're a whole lot more fun than you Christians, right? We present ourselves as the don'ters instead of the doers, right? It's a different perspective. All right. So anyway, so he describes it this way. Arnold says this. He says in Rabbinic Judaism, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is considered the light of the world. So the rabbis, when they're sitting here listening to Christ and he says, you are the light of the world, they would have been thinking, no. The Torah is the light of the world, right? Yeshua, Jesus, however, declares that those who have truth are the ones who can provide spiritual light for those in spiritual darkness. Since they are the light of the world, the admonition is, even so let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. The light of verse 14 is the good works of verse 16, right? These good works that we do, people glorify God, that is our light. Good works will not save, but those who are saved, and this is the point of James. So when you read the book of James and you get a little confused because it sounds like James is teaching salvation by works, he's not. He's just saying exactly what Arnold's saying right here. You don't get saved by works, but if you're saved, you should have works. James says what? Faith without works is dead. That's why I said, if you're a believer, you will have fruit. Because if you've got no fruit, your faith is, you've got a dead faith, which means you don't have any faith at all, right? So, when unbelievers see their works and respond to the light generated by those, they will come to the light and become believers themselves and glorify the Father who is in heaven, right? And Holcroft goes on to say this: the kingdom person, as the light of the world and as one individual lamp, must make his or her influence felt and not attempt concealment. So remember, Christ says, hey, you don't light a lamp and then do what with it? Put it under a bowl. That's an intentional act. You get the imagery he's talking about there. It's not just that you lit a lamp and then it went out because you ran out of oil or the wind blew it out. Like there's a concealment there. And that's what Holcroft is pointing out here, is that Christ says, look, not only should you be a light, but you shouldn't conceal it. But yet many times in our lives, because of pressures from the world, we'll conceal the light instead of letting the light shine because we care more about what people think than about what God thinks. All right. Now, I want you just to correlate it for a second. We're not into John chapter 8, but I want you to think about this analogy here, because one of John's favorite usages or favorite symbols in his gospel is the symbol of light, right? Now, what it says in John 8:12 says, again, therefore, Jesus spoke to them saying, now catch this. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. Now, Jesus just said that as believers, we're the light of the world. But in John chapter 8, he says he's the light of the world. So which one's true? Both. How is it true? He's in us.
That's right.
So
I'm gonna let that light, how's that song go?
this little
This
light of
little light of
mine,
mine,
and I'm gonna let it shine.
Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
Maybe we'll let you close out with that sort of a doxology or something, Shannon. Here's the thing. When we are the light of the world, that light does not come from us. We merely reflect it. Does that make sense? So the light is Christ, and as he lives in us, we reflect him to the world. Okay? So that's how, and you can only be the light if the light's in you, right? That's the other point here. Now, just take this forward, this concept then of us being light, Christ being the light that shines through us as we reflect his glory to the world. Look what Paul says in Philippians and in Ephesians. In Philippians 2:15, he says that you may prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God, above reproach in the midst of a in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world. Right? Look at, he just says there, right there. We're above reproach. Why are we above reproach? Because we are people who are righteous. That's why we keep our nose clean. I mean, that's why we are people that act righteousness, because it's our unrighteousness that Paul will say in Romans that shows the world that we're just hypocrites.
Worthy of the man walking a manner in which you were called.
That's right. So we are crooked and perverse generation among whom he appears lights in the world. In Ephesians 5:8-15, he says this: for you were formerly, get this, darkness, right? You were formerly darkness, but now you are a light in the Lord. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth. This is the whole idea of righteousness that we've been talking about. Trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord, and do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them. For it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. But all things become visible when they're exposed by the light, for everything that becomes visible is light. For this reason it says, awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Therefore be careful, this is for us, be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, right? So we have again that concept there of what is Christ saying here? You're salt, be salty. You're light, be a light. And when you're light, when we don't act righteously, our light is dimmed, right? Okay, so that's his whole point. Oh yeah, I do like what I missed that one. I like what Bach. I just like how he says it. When we're a light, we are performing a service of ministry that allows others to see how life that is a credit to God should be lived. All right, we show the world how to live in relationship with God. All right. Any questions about that so far? Beatitudes, the blessings for those who attain righteousness, the woes for those who don't attain. This is how we should be impacting the world if we are people of righteousness. Any questions or comments before we hit our last section? Okay. All right. Now we get to the heart of the entire sermon. Again, this is the hinge. This is sort of the pinnacle of it, upon which, if you think of like a scale, this is like where everything balances out. This section here, 5:17 through 5:20, tells you what the sermon is actually about. What's the purpose? Which I asked you several weeks ago. What's the purpose of the sermon? Okay. And he's going to then start giving examples of specifically what righteousness looks like, and what it looks like from what he says versus the Pharisees here in just a moment. But he's going to set this up to say, this is what we're talking about. So let's just read here this section that goes, that follows Jesus saying that we are salt and light. He says, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So what we have here, verse 20, is the whole pinnacle. He's telling you right now, you've got to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. Now, you might be asking at this point, what is the righteousness of the Pharisees? Jesus is going to spend the rest of the Sermon on the Mount telling you what the righteousness of the Pharisees looks like in comparison to what the righteousness that God has said, again, in relationship to the Mosaic Law. So that's why 520 is so important for the Sermon on the Mount, because this is what Christ is going to distinguish for the remaining 2.5 chapters, right? Oh, yeah.
Was all accomplished when Jesus said on the cross, it is accomplished?
Yes.
Okay.
With his death. I mean, yes, with his death. Yeah. Because he bore the penalty of sin, what? The penalty for sin. And was that with his life? And so the curse of the law, this is the way Paul says, the curse of the law was paid for by Christ himself. So the law told you what was righteous. The problem with the law is what?
You can't keep it.
Can't keep it. So because you can't keep it, guess what? You're under a curse. And the curse is death. So
Or
Christ
death.
paid the curse of the law with his death, and therefore fulfilled the law, because he's the only one that perfectly kept the law. And then his righteousness is imputed, given to you and I. It's not our righteousness, it's his righteousness imputed to us. And that's why the law is finished. He completed and fulfilled the law with his death. And we're no longer under the law, because the curse of the law is death. All right.
Should we go dance out in the mall?
You should if you want to. Now, I don't know if that's what we mean by the light of the world, like, you know, they might they might send a little truck for you there. Rick. There might be an ambulance that pulls up with a few people on a stretcher.
So.
You might. All right. So like I said, verses 17 through 20, that is the hinge point of the whole thing. Now, Jesus says, I did not come to abolish the law of prophets. I've not come to abolish them, to fulfill them. So what he's going to then say through the rest of chapter 5, 6 and 7 and 8:1 is, what is the true righteousness of the Mosaic law? He's not creating a new one. He's not taking that law and expanding it to make it something new. That's why he said, I came to fulfill the law. Now, what will be in contradistinction to that, and we'll see it very clearly coming up here in just a little bit, is that the Pharisees actually did add to the law. They did reinterpret what righteousness meant according to the law. So you're going to see that Jesus said, look, I came to fulfill all of it and perfectly fulfill it, but that's what I came to fulfill. It's not a new law, which the Pharisees had created. They created anyone know what it's called? Got the written law, which is the law of Moses. What laws did they create? What were they called? The oral law. The oral law. In fact, we're going to see, just kind of keep this in mind. This is for next week. I'm going to spoil it for you. When Jesus says you have heard, what he's referring to is he's referring to the oral law of the Pharisees. Because since it was oral, it wasn't written down. In fact, it wasn't written down until 200 AD.
You mentioned that quite a few times, right?
Yeah. What
you've
you've heard, he's now referring to the rabbinic oral law. When he says it is written, he's now referring to the what?
Scripture.
The written law, the Mosaic law. He's going to tell you what righteousness is in accordance to the Mosaic law, in contradistinction to the Pharisees, who are going to tell you what righteousness is according to their oral law, which is not God's law. Okay? Everyone all good so far on Sermon on the Mount? We're oral law.
But what's the other word?
The Mosaic law, the written
What's
law.
that called?
The written law, the Mosaic law.
The unwritten law.
The oral law. That's the oral law.
Yeah.
It's oral because it wasn't written,
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
It was the written one.
which is what you have in the Torah.
Thought you used a different word, that's okay.
Well, I probably slurred my speech a little bit, so. All right, so,
What do they call the oral law? They had written down.
well, it's the Mishnah is what it is.
That might have been what I was trying to.
Yeah, it's the Mishnah, which is the Targum. It's actually the Talmud, which is the the Mishnah and the Gemara, right, would make up the Talmud. Those two components. So the law and the prophets, in this case, he says, I did not come to abolish the law and the prophets. Well, the law and the prophets is the way of designating the basically entire Old Testament. So whatever was prophesied about him at his first coming and the Mosaic law, he said, I came to fulfill all of that, and I'm going to fulfill it perfectly. Now, he goes on to say here, he says, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass in the law until all is accomplished. Now, here's the thing. Let's just break this down just for a moment, because this is a very contentious verse. Rich, going back to your discussion about the lady who thinks the Mosaic law is still in effect, this is the primary verse that they're going to use for that. Okay. All right. So we'll talk about it more next week. We're not going to go into too much in depth here. I'll just sort of mention it briefly. But he starts out by saying, for truly. Now, some of your versions will say surely, or some of them will say truly, or verily, or whatever. Verily, I say to you, in the King James. What that means is it just means it's the Greek word amen, which is actually just a translation of the Hebrew word aman. And it just means to be firm or to be true. It's a truth. So Jesus is saying here, truly, I say to you. So in other words, he's punctuating what he's going to say by saying, look, what you are going to hear in the next little bit is truth. So I'm going to just point it out there. Truly, I say to you, right? Now, the interesting thing is that, this occurs 31 times in Matthew. So it's very common for Jesus to say that. And in Matthew, in John, it's always used in the double, right? So in John, he records Jesus saying not just truly or verily, but it's verily, verily, or truly, truly, which is a double punctuation of that. In other words, the idea here is that what I'm going to say is so completely, absolutely true, it cannot fail to be true. It cannot fail to come to pass, whatever I'm going to say. That's the point of what Jesus says here when he starts out by saying, for truly I say to you. All right. Now we get to this next one, because again, this is where people have lots of problems. Until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. So people look at it and go, oh, look, he says, look, as long as heaven and earth are still around, not an iota or a dot will pass from the law. That must mean, look, as far as I know, earth's still here, heaven's still there. So since they're both still here, that must mean the law is still what? Here, because not an iota, not a dot will pass. All right. Couple problems with that. First of all, you didn't finish reading the sentence. What does the sentence actually say? Until all is accomplished. So you got to finish reading it, because Jesus doesn't say, hey, look, the law is going to be in place until heaven and earth are wiped away, until they're wiped away, which one day there will be new heaven and new earth. He is not saying that. He's saying that heaven and earth, basically this concept, this expression, heaven and earth passing away, is a rabbinic expression. What it means is that the thing is so sure that it would only become unsure or not true or invalid if heaven and earth just disappeared, right? The only way that this thing isn't going to be true is if the whole thing just goes away. I mean, if there's no heaven and no earth, then you don't have to worry about the law, right? Because there isn't anything, right? There's no people, there's no nothing. So that's a rabbinic expression to say this thing is going to remain. And it cannot not remain And the only way that it couldn't remain is if heaven and earth disappeared. That's what the phrase is. So this is a rabbinic phrase that he's using to designate that the law will remain in effect, and not one element of that law will be removed until what? All is accomplished. But we have to read the all is accomplished to finish that out. Now, the problem is that the rabbis, the rabbinic, the rabbis during this time, we're going to find out that they like to focus on certain laws. They like to focus on certain things, ritual laws. They're very much in the ritual stuff. You walk this way, you wear this type of stuff, you do these things. But when it came to things like mercy, they didn't follow it. Like, they didn't follow all of the Mosaic law. And Jesus's point is going to be, hey, look, that's not true righteousness. True righteousness is you've got to follow the whole thing to the letter, including the last jot and tittle. And until all is accomplished, every single law that was given by God and every single letter in that law and every single part of every single letter will remain inviolable until all is accomplished. Does that all make sense?
No,
Does
no,
not.
I'm a little confused, but,
Okay.
and, well, in part how it's written here, that, until all is accomplished, when it says, truly, truly, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a doubt would pass from, until all is accomplished.
That's right. And when was all accomplished?
Is it back to the cross?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And in fact, if you go back to the Old Testament,
So how does the passing of heaven and earth fit into that? Until
that's
heaven
just
and
a,
earth pass away.
that's just a phrase. It was just it's a rabbinic phrase to mean that this thing is firm. Like the law is, you cannot remove a part of it, that the law will remain in effect in all of its, every single element of it. And the phrase until heaven and earth pass away is a way of saying, look, it's the only way that it would ever go away, that the law wouldn't exist anymore, is if there wasn't a heaven and an earth. Because if there's no people and there's no heaven and earth, there's no reason for a law, right? Does that all make sense? That's all it's basically a metaphorical way of speaking about the inviolable nature of the law that cannot be gotten rid of. That's what that means.
It seems to me that this could be misinterpreted, right?
Well, it is misinterpreted. It's misinterpreted in the way I just said. People will look at that and go, oh, until heaven and earth passes away, the law is
Still in effect.
the law is still in
Still have
effect.
to obey the law.
But as I said, that's only if you break it off before the last little bit.
Is that the same contemporary phrase until hell freezes over?
Yes. Okay, you know what? Hey, Chris, you said it way better than I did. Because all that is saying is like, it's impossible.
Yeah.
Until hell freezes over, it's not going to do it. Until heaven and earth passes away. You know, you should come up here and teach this thing, because that was way better. That was way better than my explanation. Well, thank you, God, for putting that, because maybe that makes it a little bit easier. Yes, but that's why it's misinterpreted. All right. That's right. You got to follow it through, and when it's accomplished on the cross, he said, "It is what? Finished." And we're going to get into this. We're going to get into this a little bit more next week, right? But even the Old Testament, which is where the New Covenant is found. New Covenant is not found in the New Testament. It's given in the Old Testament. It's only applied to the death of Christ in the New. But the Old Covenant, the New Covenant is actually given in the Old Testament, in Ezekiel and in Jeremiah. And in the Old Testament, before there ever was a New Testament, before there ever was a Jesus, the Old Testament proclaimed that the Mosaic Law was going to be superseded, taken over by a new covenant. So So this isn't just Christians here that are trying to be like, oh, well, we don't like the Mosaic law. We want to get rid of that because we don't like it. The Old Testament itself prophesied and foretold that the Mosaic covenant was going to end and a new covenant was going to be introduced. All right. Yeah, great.
What is Paul referring to? Is that just the law?
It's his death. So in other words, the new covenant, and we could go, if we went back to Jeremiah, we went back to Ezekiel, we could look at the new covenant, but the spiritual aspect, the components of that, it's not all spiritual, but the spiritual aspects are the fact that his death on the cross provides a new way that salvation comes and is applied to humankind, particularly the Jews, the new covenant, but it extends to the Gentiles. So all that's accomplished on the cross is his death. Now, that doesn't mean everything is accomplished. It just means the redemptive work of Christ is done. And when the redemptive work of Christ is done, the old covenant goes away.
Would they have understood that?
Would they have understood?
Would the audience have understood all of like Jesus's death being the fulfillment of the law?
No, not.
So, and is this more like we're able to understand it after the fact, but
Sure.
while he was actually saying this to the crowd, they wouldn't have
Yeah.
understood it?
Yeah, because remember, his disciples didn't even think he was going to die. So that whole concept is something that the death and the resurrection had to occur even for them to believe, right? So, but he's talking now in the future, even if they don't understand it, they're going to remember that. That's the reason why Paul can go back and talk about the new covenant of Christ and on the night where they were at the upper room and the Last Supper. But he's now looking back on that as already realized eschatology at that point, not unrealized eschatology. So anyway, so he talks about this iota, this or you might see jot and tittle in your book, or iota and dot. Either way, basically it's referring to the parts of a Hebrew letter. So if anyone know Hebrew at all? Okay, well, okay. Anyway, those are jots and tittles in there, yes. So Rich, thank you.
Jot and a tittle.
That's right. And in fact, if you so I can read Hebrew here. If you take a look at this Rosh and Dalet right here, they look almost identical. In fact, if you don't have 20/20 vision or your vision's not very good, you're going to think it's the same letter, but it's not. The Dalet over here has just a little bit of a tiny little tail. And that's the difference between the D and the R. So that right there is just a little tittle, and there is the yod, which is this little, like, it looks like an apostrophe. That's the jot that you have there. So I have up in here, an example would be like in our smaller case I, the little dot at the top of that, right? That right there is the yod or the jot, right? And then the tittle would be, if you notice the difference between a P and an R, it's just that the R has a little bit of an extension. Now, this is a little bit more visible in English than it would be in Hebrew. Most of the Hebrew is not quite as distinguishable, but that's kind of the difference between that. And so basically what Jesus is saying here is this, is like it's not even just the law. It's not even just the words that make up the law. And it's not even just the letters that make up the words that make up the law. It's the components of each letter that make up the words that make up the law. Does that all make sense? So he's going down and saying, like, look, down to the smallest imaginable piece, the law in its entirety will be fulfilled. That's what he's saying, right? Louis Barbieri says this. He says, these things are important because letters make up words, and even a slight change in a letter might change the meaning of a word. Jesus said he would fulfill the law by obeying it perfectly and fulfill the prophet's predictions of the Messiah and his kingdom. But the responsibility of the people was made clear. The righteousness they were currently seeking, that of the righteousness and the teachers of the law, was insufficient for entrance into the kingdom Jesus was offering. The righteousness he demanded was not merely external. It was a true inner righteousness based on faith in God's word. All right. Now, I have just a quick quote here from Arnold, and this is, I want to put this in here because I think it makes a point. He says, the fact that Yeshua mentioned the specific parts of the Hebrew alphabet again directs the focus on the written, not the oral law, right? So you should start talking about the jot and the tittle. He's talking about the written law. So when he expounds on what righteousness means, it's righteousness that God demanded within his word, not this oral law that God did not give, but that the rabbis and the Pharisees said was required. Okay, we're almost done here. Then we get to this next section where he just basically says, hey, look, it's just as it's summation of this section right here. Jesus saying, hey, look, it's not that you have to just keep the biggies. You got to keep the small ones. Like when he completely fulfilled the law, he kept every single one, not just the ones that he liked, not just the ones that he thought were important, because that's what the Pharisees did. They really, really went in their own laws even, they really focused on certain things. Most of it was ritual. Because guess what? It's easy to follow ritual laws. Do you know what I mean? It's easy to say, I need to wear this particular outfit to be righteous. That's super easy because all I'm doing is putting something on. It's super easy to say, don't walk more than this on a certain day, this distance. That's easy. I may not like it, but it's certainly easy to do. But guess what? None of that means that there is any righteousness internally in my heart. Right? I could be wicked and cruel and depraved and wear a nice ritual suit. Does that make sense? And so the problem that is going on here, as we'll see, is that they not only focused on certain laws and didn't focus on others, they focused on only the external outward look of that. It didn't matter if you were lusting after someone in your heart, as long as you didn't go do it. As long as you looked the part, that's enough. Make sense? All right. So David Flusser, I like the way that he kind of sums this up in his book, Jewish Sources in Early Christianity. He says this, says the minor commandments are as important as the major ones, and one should be as scrupulous in keeping the moral commandments as one is in keeping the ritual ones. Jesus's position is made clear in the 5th chapter of Matthew. There he speaks of keeping the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, without transgressing against a jot or tittle. Anyone transgressing against the least commandment will not enter the kingdom of heaven, and anyone who keeps the minor commandments and teaches others to keep them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. He emphasizes that the righteousness of his disciples in keeping the commandments must be greater than that of the scribes, or else they shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. All right? So that's where we're going to end tonight. Now, what's going to happen here, we'll talk a little bit next week, Rich, about some objections to the law not ending. We'll cover that just a little bit, not much, but we'll sort of provide a little bit more context there. And then,
so in these verses, who's Jesus talking to? Is he talking to his disciples?
Yeah.
Okay.
in fact, if you go back to the beginning of the Beatitudes,
Right.
remember, he went up on the mountain to pray
Yeah.
all by himself because he couldn't get away because of the crowds.
They came up to him on the.
He went down, his disciples met him, he goes up to this, some sort of a flat place,
Around.
and they all followed his disciples because they're like, well, we can't find Jesus, so we probably should follow them because his disciples will know. So it ends up being that, but it says he sat down and taught his disciples, who he had just, by the way, remember, named as apostles. So he's teaching his disciples what true righteousness is, because he wants them to know that he's not just on board with the Pharisees. He's not just a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He's not just regurgitating Pharisaic Judaism and doing a whole bunch of miracles besides. He's going to start positioning himself as different than the Pharisees, and that's going to be primarily important for his disciples, right? Now, the rest of the crowd that follows him, they get the benefit of listening to his sermon, but it's not really designed for them. Okay. What other questions do they have? Okay, so what I'd like you to do is just start to think about, maybe read a little bit ahead and just keep this in mind. What Christ is going to do is he's going to start giving examples of what that distinction looks like. You've heard it said, boom, boom, boom. He's presenting Pharisaic theology. But I say, now he's speaking with authority, the authority of God, and then he's going to give the distinction. So he's going to start to show throughout the next 2.5 chapters what the difference is now. He's already told you in general what a righteous person looks like and how they position themselves to God and to man. He's already talked about what an unrighteous person looks like, how they pursue their own self-interest and their own needs and their own desires, right? He's given some woes about that. He's talked about what our impact should be to the world if you are a believer, all right? And the fact that my purpose in telling you this is that it is going to be fulfilled. I'm going to show you in my own life what true righteousness is, because I am going to fulfill it 100%. If you want to look to what righteousness looks like, look to Christ, because he told you, I'm going to fulfill it. So all you have to do is just watch him. Just watch his life. And he's going to, at the very end, be like, I fulfilled it all and I did not break one of the laws. I show you what righteousness is. And then when he dies, that righteousness then gets imputed to us. So that's the whole thing. And then the rest of it is him giving those examples to show what that looks like between false righteousness and the righteousness of Christ that he points out. Does that make sense? Sermon on the Mount, 3 chapters. Here's your summary.
Scribes sometimes writing down and copying the various passages of scripture in Hebrew. Occasionally, they might miss one of those jots or tittles, and that results in some mistranslation of some of the passages.
Yeah, now the interesting thing is that almost, well, with extreme rare exception, that didn't happen with the Jews in the Hebrew Bible. Where you find that is you find that mostly happening in the Greek translation of the New Testament, because many times those started to be copied by non-Jewish people that didn't have the same reverence. So if you were a Jew and you were a scribe and you were copying the Old Testament, you would have to, when you came to the name of where God is, you would have to stop. You'd have to go take a bath and come back. So if you had a couple of verses where it had the name of God, I mean, you had to do certain things, and they actually had a counter, and they would burn it. They wouldn't just make corrections. They would burn the whole thing. And so they had a very rigorous system. So that's the reason why in the Old Testament, there are very few disputed passages. Like you can look at the Old Testament and be like, there's not many differences in anything there. In the New Testament, there's all kinds of them. But then we've got a great problem there, because now we've got 25 or 28,000, I think is what it is right now, copies of either full or partial of the New Testament, so that we know 99.95% of what the New Testament says. But that's a different story. But your point, my point is that the Jewish scribes, that wouldn't have been their issue. That would have been Gentile scribes that were less careful in how they would do it. But they certainly could. Like if your eyes, and you're doing it for a while and it's dim and by candlelight, if you miss that little, like the little jot or a tittle, it turns it from a D to an R for sure. All right. No. All right. Any other questions or comments?
So the righteousness that he's talking about is his righteousness, not the Pharisaic righteousness.
Let me nuance it just a moment. The righteousness he's referring to is the righteousness required in the Mosaic law as given by God. Now, what's going to be demonstrated, though, is he's going to say, look, none of you have done it.
The Pharisees.
Nobody has.
No.
But he said, I am going to fulfill all of it, so what he's making a claim there is that he's the one that has never broken the Mosaic law. And at his death, then he's the only one that is the proper sacrifice because he's never committed sin, because he's never broken law. So the righteousness he's referring to is, what did God say you must do in the Mosaic law? That's righteousness. Now look at me, because I'm going to fulfill that. So follow me in my example of righteousness, right? Does that all make sense?
It's possible for anybody to follow the law, but only right.
That's right. And that's the reason why we call it grace, because his righteousness is imputed. It's basically clothed on top of you, because you can't do it on your own, which is absolutely amazing to think that's what happens. Like, his righteousness is transferred to you and I. It's imputed to us. That's the word. It's given to us. We're clothed in his righteousness, because we could never do it on our own, right? So anyway, we can get into that, but yeah, that's exactly what's going on. Let me just end tonight just with a real quick portion from Paul, and this is comes from Romans chapter 12. Again, this is after his big theological discussion, and starting in chapter 12 through chapter 16 is the practical application of the theology of chapters 1 through 11. And this is what he says in Romans 12:9. It says, "Let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good, love one another with brotherly affection, outdo one another in showing honor." Now remember, what did he say earlier? Hey, if you want people to fame and fortune, you want people to kind of call out your name, Paul says just the opposite here. Outdo one another in showing others honor. Not about me, it's about you, right? Do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit, serve the Lord, rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, and seek to show hospitality. Like, that's sort of, in a way, a recap of most of the Beatitudes. Paul just has phrased it a little differently. That's how people will know you're different, is if you live that way, right? So thank you for coming tonight, and we will see you next week. Again, read ahead a little bit so you can kind of get a flavor of what's coming for the next couple chapters. All right, shalom, shalom. Thank you. Thank you, everyone
Shalom,
online.
Randall.
Hey, buddy.
Later.